Good evening and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program. My name is Avinoam Pat, and I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut, where I hold the Doris and Simon Conover Chair in Judaic Studies. It is a great pleasure for us to welcome our distinguished speaker this evening, Professor Berel Lang, who will deliver this year's Jean and Georgia Mittelman Lecture in Judaic Studies, which will be titled Against the Lachrymose View of Jewish History, Again. I should mention before we start that I'm so grateful that we are all here together this evening for this program. This was actually one of the first programs that we had to reschedule in the spring semester. It was originally scheduled for March 11th, I believe, the afternoon of March 11th. And that was the week when we began having to cancel everything. And even at the time, Berel Lang was determined to come to campus to deliver the lecture, but I'm happy that we're able to meet here virtually for this program tonight. Before I introduce our speaker and go over the program for tonight, I just want to make a couple of technical notes and a couple of announcements for upcoming programs. For those of you who are joining us here this evening, you may be interested in a few upcoming programs that we have co-sponsored with the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford, as we are grateful to them for also co-sponsoring tonight's program. On November 9th, in just about 2 weeks, in conjunction with Kristallnacht, we will have a panel discussion on the past, present, and future of anti-Semitism, the culmination of a course on anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in the ancient, medieval, and modern periods with Professor Dina Grant, Professor Jonathan Ellikin from Trinity College, and myself. And that may be an appropriate segue for our topic for tonight, where Berel will discuss the Lachrymose view of Jewish history. But on November 9th, in conjunction with Kristallnacht, we will have this panel discussion on the past, present, and future of anti-Semitism. On November 11th of the same week, I'm also happy to announce that we will be having a special program in conjunction with my Israel History and Society class this semester. We'll be welcoming the creators of the hit Israeli sketch comedy series HaYehudim Ba'im, or The Jews Are Coming. Two of the creators of the show, Natalie Marcus and Asaf Bezer, with their satirical and witty takes on Jewish history, will be joining us that day at 11:30 a.m. as part of my class. It is open to the public, and we would love to have you join us for what should be a very, very special program. So now to the program this evening. I am so delighted to welcome Professor Berel Lang for this talk on Against the Lachrymose View of Jewish History Again. Just as the historian Salo Baron attacked the Lachrymose view of Jewish history as mistakenly focused on events or practices of persecution and violence in that history, at the same time providing strong evidence that still more basic factors shape the history of Jewish flourishing and survival. This same Lachrymose view, and I'm sure this is part of what Berel will be addressing tonight, still nonetheless continues to dominate current popular Jewish understanding and has severe, even dangerous practical consequences. Professor Berel Lang is a professor of philosophy emeritus from SUNY Albany. He has been visiting professor at the Hebrew University, the University of Connecticut, where we are delighted to welcome him back, Wesleyan University, and elsewhere. He received his BA from Yale University and his PhD in philosophy from Columbia University. He has received fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Association, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Hebrew University. He's the author of many books, including Act and Idea in the Nazi Genocide, The Anatomy of Philosophical Style, Holocaust Representation, Art Within the Limits of History and Ethics, and Philosophical Witnessing, the Holocaust as Presence, among others. He is also the author of Primo Levi, The Matter of a Life. So it is a great honor to welcome Professor Lang to speak with us this evening. As I unmute him, I will just mention that our program for this evening, Professor Lang will give his lecture. And if you have questions as you're listening to the lecture, I would ask that you please type them into the chat so that after the lecture, I'll moderate a Q&A. And if you have questions that you'd like to ask verbally, you can also indicate that in the chat so that I know to call on you. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Berel Lang.
Well, thank you very much, Avi, and thanks for the invitation. And thanks to the audience, the unseen audience, for tuning in. I'll be talking about and against the Lachrymose conception of Jewish history, which has held forth and continues to hold forth in popular Jewish discourse and from the outside world as well. And I'm arguing that term is misplaced, or that emphasis is misplaced, but I'll elaborate on that, I hope, as the talk goes on. We don't often encounter the term lachrymose. It certainly isn't a word that historians turn to when they write about even the most horrific events. In its current use, the word's Latin root, lacrima, would announce a tearful event, and professional historians, whatever they're writing about, rarely express such emotion. It was understandable then that when Salo Baron, the first professor of Jewish history in the United States, he was appointed at Columbia in 1929, when Baron criticized earlier Jewish historians for advocating a lachrymose conception of Jewish history, which he was criticizing. He was attacking them for the phrase struck a nerve. What Baron challenged there was the view that placed persecution and the role of victimhood as central to the 3,000-year history of the Jews. In challenging that tearful view, Baron did not ignore, of course, the occurrence of persecution and violence in Jewish history. He was contesting its exaggerated importance in a history of a diversely creative community, rich in culture, civil life, and religious coherence, of a people who flourished despite the occurrence of persecution, as well as through the longer periods of their history from which that was entirely absent. Baron died in 1989, but the influence of his critique of the lachrymose view continues, with many later and contemporary Jewish historians building on it. Outside the scholarly world, however, in popular Jewish culture, the lachrymose view of Jewish history, the tearful view of Jewish history that Baron challenged, has not only survived, but has thrived. There, meaning now, the lachrymose view has been a significant presence, with what seemed to me harmful, even dangerous consequences for the Jewish community. And as that lachrymose view of the past maintains a grip in the present, it seems important to show how relevant Baron's criticism of the view is now to Jewish communal opinion, that is, to Jewish history as it's now being lived by us. I begin with a statement of Baron's in a 1963 essay of his. He notes there, and here I'm quoting, "All my life, I have been struggling against the dominant lachrymose conception of Jewish history," a phrase that he coined and that he says he was been using for more than 40 years. So that very phrase gives his thesis away, the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, which he's criticizing. Baron's reflection on his anti-Lachrymose attack is relevant here, in particular for two dates. First, for the year he cites as the beginning of his attack, about 1923, that's going farther back, and it's aimed then at Jewish historiography, the way Jewish history had been written in the 19th and early 20th century. It's important, secondly, for 1963, the date when his essay was published, for at that time, 18 years after the end of the Holocaust, Baron underscores his criticism of the Lachrymose view, not finding even that extraordinary event, the Holocaust, sufficient to prove the Lachrymose thesis of Jewish history. Baron himself was, of course, aware personally and a historian of what the Nazis had done to the Jews. Among much else, they had murdered his parents. And 2 years before writing this essay that I cited, Baron had testified as an expert witness in Jerusalem's Eichmann trial. His statement about his own long struggle against the Lachrymose view thus leaves no doubt that even the final solution that Hitler promulgated didn't weaken or alter his objections to it. He was objecting to the Lachrymose view even in light of the Holocaust. For him, the 3,000-year hit Jewish history evidently had survived that too and warranted his focus. It's worth rehearsing the grounds on which Baron based his objection. Put generally, he claimed that the 3,000-year span of Jewish history was shaped by much more than the twofold occurrence of persecution and victimhood that the Lachrymose view emphasizes, achievements that cannot be explained only as defensive reactions to persecution. That a relatively small people had survived as a group over millennia itself suggests more complex causes than only a defensive reaction, unless persecution itself were seen as causing that survival, a claim that has been made at times and I discuss here later. In detailing what he means by other causes, Baron points to factors in Jewish history demonstrating the group's inventive creativity fostered by the shared social and religious commitments on which the Jews built structural frameworks and cultural institutions. A multitude of factors resulting not only in survival, but flourishing. Key to Baron's claim, as David Engel has put it, was his effort to shift the focus of historians from even the largest events, occurrences of persecution, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the expulsion, the Holocaust. So there's no shortage of examples, but to move the focus away from them toward a recognition of the structural advances that sustained the Jewish people during, before, and after those events. Baron's scholarly anti-Lachrymose thesis continues to influence the writing of Jewish history, but it's important to recall that Baron drew from evidence mainly on conditions of Jewish life in medieval Europe, with emphasis on the Mediterranean basin of Spain, Portugal, and North Africa. That time and those places, he argued, saw a flourishing of Jewish culture and creativity that outweighed political or religious restrictions on the communities, and even the ultimate disruption of those communities by the Inquisition and the 15th century expulsion didn't alter that. Similar counter-evidence, he claimed, figured in other periods of Jewish history, also there outweighing external political and religious constraints and even violence. But despite broad scholarly recognition of Baron's criticism, the Lachrymose view of Jewish history has not only survived, but continues to dominate popular discourse with what seemed to me harmful, even dangerous consequences. Obviously, this latter twofold claim requires evidence for each of its parts. First, then, to establish that popular opinion in the Jewish community indeed follows the Lachrymose line. Here I would ask my audience, my listeners here, to consider how familiar to them is the theme of Jewish persecution and victimhood, the extent to which familiarity with that theme resonates for them in their own readings or hearings of current news and opinion pieces, in talks or other discussions in Jewish cultural or religious life. This is not asking to ask their opinion of the Lachrymose view, but only about their familiarity with it. Given the impossibility here in the present format of a vote on this question, I mention only that my own previous polling indicates substantial familiarity with those themes, and I would suppose that even readers unfamiliar with the Lachrymose view would find interest in evidence both of its role in the past and its persistence in the present. That evidence might find a dramatic starting point in the Haggadah, the narrative recited on Passover that retells the exodus of the enslaved Jews from Egypt. A crucial sentence in that text reminds readers, here I'm quoting, "In every generation they stand to destroy us." The floating signifier there, they, emphasizes that the perpetrators may act under various names, but with one common intention, the destruction of the Jews. The phrase every generation, furthermore, implies actions taken not only against earlier generations, but against present and future ones. It thus moves past the Haggadah's own date, the 3rd or 4th century CE, to whenever the Seder words are recited, past, present, and future. Assuming a 25-year span for a generation, destruction would in these terms be threatened 4 times a century, meaning that for any such period, it needs always to be expected. It's a constant presence. The force of that expectation is underscored in a passage that soon follows in the Haggadah, where readers learn that not only their ancestors took part in the Exodus, but that they should regard themselves as also having been present in that exit. In every generation, here I'm quoting from the Haggadah, in every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he came out of Egypt, not only our ancestors. The past in this way surfaces not only in commemoration, but as present, the past as being present. Of course, the Haggadah is a single text, but it is canonical and it forecasts Lachrymose claims in recurring popular appearances. So to fast forward, a recent New York Times opinion piece asserted that there has not been, here I'm quoting, there has not been a single moment in Jewish history in which there weren't anti-Semites determined to eradicate Judaism and the Jews, with the author of that piece not even attempting to give evidence of any such moment, let alone of everyone. Or again, as an editorial in a New York Jewish Weekly recently reminded its readers, the blood libel against the Jews never really goes away, with the never in that statement omitting any specific evidence, as though its sweeping truth could be simply taken for granted. It didn't need specific examples. Exaggerations of this sort, furthermore, turn into literal assertions when they're accompanied by proposals for specific action, as in the analogy sometimes drawn between current anti-Semitic attacks worldwide and Nazi Germany in the 1930s. That German Jews failed to take seriously Nazi actions in the 30s is understood here as proof that that any comparison should be taken more seriously now. But we know that analogies are always partial, and the gap in this one is compelling. Nazi threats were explicit before the party gained power in 1933, but they became more than threats only after Nazis gained control of the government, control they had openly sought and that once achieved was decisive for the occurrence of the Holocaust. Advocates of that analogy, however, typically ignore that crucial condition, and harmful and repugnant as recent anti-Semitic acts in the United States and elsewhere have been, no evidence points at present to a concerted political movement working toward a similarly extreme end. Objections such as these, however, have not checked the popularity of the Lachrymose view in public references by national Jewish speakers in synagogue sermons and commemorative rallies, in Israel's claim of its own protective role for diaspora communities, and increasingly as Israel itself adopts the Holocaust as a focal point of its own Jewish identity. Here a parenthetical comment for official visitors to Israel now who have time to view only one national site. Yad Vashem has displaced the Western world, the Western Wall, which is significant, I believe, symbolically. This growing emphasis contrasts with the earlier, often hostile attitude in Israel towards diasporic Jews, extended later even to post-Holocaust survivor immigrants. Israel's roles as a home for the survivors who otherwise had none to return to, and as the potential rescuer of diaspora Jews more generally, however one otherwise judges those roles, underscore the Lachrymose view of the Jewish diaspora as it occurs now. Again, this criticism of the Lachrymose view is meant not to ignore the acts of persecution in Jewish history, but to broaden the context in which that history is viewed. This need has special relevance, I believe, for the United States with its founding advocacy of individual unalienable rights now being widened, extended to include minority or group rights. Viewed in that context, recent acts of anti-Semitism seem not only anti-Semitic, but also part of the increase in ethnic prejudice and violence, still more broadly of increasing mass violence as such. The Sandy Hook, Connecticut school massacre of 2012 that took 26 student lives, 20 of them elementary school children, had no specific minority target, nor did the 2017 massacre in the First Baptist Church in Sutherland, Texas, that took 25 lives of Christian churchgoers. More recently, 2 days after a violent attack wounded 5 Jews in Muncie, New Jersey, an attack in another Texas church claimed 2 lives, while a third person there was wounded. That there has been increasing emphasis on individual threats and acts against Jews thus seems to reflect, at least in part, the increasing occurrence of violence against minority groups generally, whether long-standing minorities or those stipulated for the moment. Individual groups understandably concern themselves first with their own situations, but common to specific events like the ones mentioned is a broader issue than the justification only of self-interest. The need for recognizing this broader context shapes a question I've posed randomly to both Jewish and non-Jewish Americans. What would they decide for themselves if, from the standpoint of their own personal safety, they had to choose between having an American Jewish or an African American identity, between an American Jewish or an African American identity. My random polling here found virtual unanimity on the side of American Jewish identity, suggesting again that the problem of anti-Semitism in the United States and more generally incorporates factors broader than only those motivating anti-Semitism. Such ostensibly unrelated issues as economic inequality, inadequate systems of healthcare and education, and gun control clearly bear on what is often assumed to be a standalone problem, namely anti-Semitism. But it's not a standalone problem. Even if we acknowledge these considerations, however, the question still persists of why, against the historical evidence, the Lachrymose view of Jewish history continues to flourish in popular communal discourse in the Jewish community as well as elsewhere. And here, additional broadening of the context turns out to reveal variations on a widespread, arguably generic lachrymosity, strained word, but the occurrence of the lachrymose also in non-Jewish ethnic, national, and religious history. What I've called lachrymosity, in other words, has a transcultural reach, also transnationally expressed in survival narratives. Evidently, just as personal memories of pain and suffering last more vividly than do memories of pleasure or celebration, group pain seems also to shape group responses and the formation of collective identities. A pre-Holocaust 20th century example of such group pain and memory was the Turkish persecution of Armenians during and after World War I. This genocide, added to the Holocaust and precedents from earlier centuries, extending after all back to biblical accounts, figured in the notable campaign at the United Nations in 1948, when the General Assembly adopted what has become known as the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. This criminalizing of genocide in that protocol, in that General Assembly resolution, succeeded because of significant support also from smaller South and Central America member states of the UN, who, although minimally affected by the recent Holocaust, recognized in their own individual histories experience of genocide or mass violence. It might be argued that Jewish history, because of its length, has included more such survival events than other group histories, that the Jews have survived more. And certainly the Exodus, the destruction of the two temples, 586 BCE, 70 CE, the 15th century expulsions from Spain and Portugal, and the Holocaust are distinctive. But the issue here is less one of numbers than of struggles overcome as they shape cultural memory. In an extreme version, the Lachrymose view of Jewish history identifies persecution not only as a feature of Jewish survival, but as a principal cause of it, with the reasoning behind that claim straightforward. The recurrent attacks on Jews impelled Jewish group solidarity and its accompanying defensive ingenuity, both of these crucial factors in survival. And again, Baron's criticism of this explanation of the Lachrymose, this Lachrymose explanation does not dispute the history of Jewish persecution, only its centrality as a causal factor in Jewish survival. One might add here a parenthetical comment. One might add to Baron's historical criticism one logical implication of linking Jewish survival to the recurrence of persecution. If that link were truly significant or central, contemporary Jews ought to express gratitude to past persecutors, perhaps even to welcome new ones. That would be an extreme implication, obviously, although it's not made up out of whole cloth. Not even these reservations, however, have deterred ongoing versions of the Lachrymose view of Jewish history. Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, in his reflections on the Jewish question, argues that in 1946, argued that anti-Semitism was responsible not only for Jewish survival, but for the creation of Jewish identity in the first place. Admittedly, Sartre reached that conclusion in the shadow of Nazism. He wrote those words while he was himself a German prisoner of war. And the Nazis' pseudo-scientific racial definition of Jews did impose a Jewish identity on many people whose own Jewish identification had been minimal or even non-existent. For Jewish group identity, however, the argument loses whatever force it has for individuals, since although persecution might arguably affect individual self-identity once the group existed, it could not have had that effect before them. Few Lachrymose narratives have been as extreme as Sartre's, but all emphasize the binary relationship between persecution and victimhood as having shaped Jewish history and culture. The reasons for this are speculative, but certain of them seem almost self-evident. Prominent among these is the attraction of anyone's identity as victim in its two-sided suggestion, both of the victim's innocence, to be a victim implies innocence, and the injustice, secondly, of whatever made the victim a victim. The term victim itself implies that the victim had not been responsible for being assigned that role, that in terms of causes, the victim is by implication innocent or was innocent. Improbable as it may seem that such features of victimhood should make the role of victim even attractive, evidence of just that is the attractiveness of the role of victim, has also been clear. With the Lachrymose view of Jewish history, an instance of that. To be sure, this particular instance is balanced, even outweighed by Jewish survival in the face of adversity. But it also encourages the victim's side of the identity at stake, with that role integrated into the Lachrymose view, part of any explanation of its attraction and of its persistence. It is furthermore directly related to the dangers it engenders in the community, specifically in what seem to me three types of harm or damage, actual as well as potential, for which it is responsible. First, a sense of being under constant threat with a continuing consciousness of danger, communal and or individual, has its own negative consequences. To be sure, awareness of some danger is common, as in crossing a street or driving a car, but such normal dangers differ basically from a continuing sense of imminent violence. Among other things, the latter is open to, even encourages false positives, what have been called false positives, apparent dangers reacted to, but without due cause, disrupting relations inside and outside the group. Inside, as it pressures, as it increases defensive measures taking up increasing space. Externally, through expectations of or demands for help from other groups who may not respond either because they deny the need or because they have more pressing priorities. The basic harm here is the power it gives other groups to shape the persecuted group's actions, shifting its focus from its own self-expression and self-determination. Just as someone with an allergy reacts to a cause which has no effect on others, the external source becomes a menace here without the groups having done anything to warrant it, thus also intensifying its anticipation of future aggression. Although the slogan, the familiar slogan, never again, is and has been an understandable response to the Holocaust, its widespread application to lesser events exaggerates their importance and dilutes its original force. Second, anxiety about potential aggression leads the self-alleged victim on a continuing search for reassurance from others to deter the prospective threat, initiating expectations for acts or pledges of assistance. But the others, in quotation mark, the others who might be recruited in this way may not acknowledge the danger or their obligation to respond to it, thus intensifying a situation that's already fraught. And because anxiety about the supposed danger is constant, it will not be dispelled or diminished by offers or even acts of help, since no reassurance can reduce the certainty, as they see it, of future menace. What follow then are recriminations against anyone who disputes or minimizes the danger, a reaction that further isolates those endangered from those on whom they call for assistance. Third, the identity of victimhood has its own severe consequences. Belief that one has been singled out for persecution fosters a sense in the victim of what I've called reactive freedom, freedom to react because of the involuntary imposed role assigned to the victim, with no boundaries set for that reaction, for the victim's reaction. Instances of this latter response have in fact ranged widely from appeals to justice on the principle of an eye for an eye, to demands for specific amounts of compensation, to straightforward revenge in the guise of justice. The latter of these, revenge, all of these directed at the agents of the alleged harm, but all of them with the absence of any settled limits. The possibility and thus temptation of excess is constant, thus also the temptation of replicating the original wrong with a one-time scapegoat, turning the tables by reassigning to others the role of scapegoat. These instances of harm caused appear in my description as possibilities, but they've been amply exemplified, in fact, as listeners may recognize from their own examples. Whether such reactions have been caused by the Lachrymose view in the Jewish present is an open question, but the Lachrymose view is at least both a contributor and a symptom. I close then with a question parallel to one raised earlier about readers' familiarity with the Lachrymose view of Jewish history in general. This question now asks whether readers also recognize examples of the harms I've described together with their relationship to the Lachrymose view of Jewish history. Conclusions to talk like this one do not usually take the form of a question, but unusual problems call for unusual solutions, and here that solution would be the reader's judgment of the applicability of the account I've presented, or of course, also of its inapplicability. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Berel. And I think we'd all agree that even though we had to wait from March until now to hear you give this lecture, it was well worth the wait. So there are already a number of questions that are coming in through the chat, and I would encourage those in the audience who have been listening and to this very thought-provoking and also provocative talk to register their reactions and also to ask questions through the chat function. So, Berel,
Don't leave out objections, Avi.
what's that?
Don't leave out objections.
Objections are encouraged. That is the idea of a provocative talk. It is meant to push us and also to challenge our preconceptions of the way we view this history. So since these questions are already starting to come in, I'm going to start to ask you as they come in, so we can get to as many of these questions as possible. And I will ask the questions, and if the questioner wants to chime in and add more, feel free. So Eitan Marcos asked the first question, and so I'll start with Eitan's question. Eitan writes that in the Tanakh, they talk about the quote, good times as being a 40-year period of quiet, that the good times are the times between the bad times.
It wasn't really a question. It was more kind of following on that but even before the Haggadah, we're already talking about, you live between the bad times. The good times are between the two bad times. It was just a comment. It's not.
So, but I'm going to turn it into a question now, Eitan. So, because I think there is something here in terms of the way in which we write Jewish history and the way in which we write history in general, which is that there is a tendency to, and I think Salo Baron wanted us to focus on those periods in between the periods of persecution, the very long, stable periods of Jewish history, not the periods of persecution, which tended to be the Lachrymose view of Jewish history. And so as a first question, Berel, I want to ask you to reflect sort of even on this longer history of sort of the way in which the narrative is written and the way in which the history is written. If you can also comment on sort of why it is that we tend to write history in this way, that focuses on these periods of persecution and not the longer periods of stability and cultural flourishing and not reacting to outbreaks of violence?
Well, that's certainly an important question, but it seems to me that at one level, the answer is fairly clear. Does one, in one's own personal, individual memory, is it pain or pleasure that one remembers more vividly? I mean, the most painful events in a person's life seem to me, anyway, from my experience, from reading others' experience, it's the painful moments that impress themselves. Now, one might say, that's unfortunate. Why not remember the pleasure as more dominant than the pain? Well, it's not a question of legislating, it's a question of memory. And it seems to me that, of course, there are celebrations, Independence Day, and this and that. I mean, there are national celebrations, personal celebrations, anniversaries, and so on. But really, I think in almost in physiological terms, it seems to me that memory impresses itself more penetratingly than the alternative, than other emotional states. So that's the beginning of an answer at both an individual and I think also at a corporate level. I mean, of course, there are national holidays of celebration, Independence Day, and so on, but they all focus on either military actions or wars and so on.
So the next question actually follows somewhat on that idea, and it's actually a comment that comes from my father, Yehuda Pat, who is joining us from Santa Fe, New Mexico, who is logged in as my mother, but I know that it's my father, Yehuda, who's here. And
Oh,
he notes that it would seem that the Jewish people possess a national PTSD, or sort of a collective sense of traumatization. And I wonder to expand on that. I mean, I think I hear your point about sort of that memory, painful memories tend to impress themselves more than sort of pleasant memories in a certain way, right? You remember those traumatic events. I guess the question is, though, how does this happen collectively, right? So how do we take events that we don't experience individually and turn them into collective memory? One example of this would be sort of American Jews and the relationship between Jews living in the United States, let's say in the 1940s and 50s, and their relationship to the Holocaust, and the ways in which it's become a more central component of American Jewish collective memory in the decades after, or for that matter, in Israel, a very parallel process that you mentioned in your talk, where the Holocaust has become a more central component of national identity 75 years after the war than it ever was in the first decades after the war. So how does this become sort of a collective form of identification?
well, I mean, it's too simple to draw a direct parallel between individual memory and collective memory, but I think some of the same factors are at work in both. I mean, collective pain in some ways, in the same way that collective action has a distinctive attractions. Collective pain, hard to say it has its collective attraction, but yes, I mean, collective suffering adds weight to individual acts which one knows as either as part of one's own history or of the history of the group of which one is a member. I don't think there's a sharp division between those two there. Look, the reason, I mean, what motivates memory anyway? And I think it's been shown, I don't know, one doesn't trust the psychologist, but that pain lasts longer than pleasure or non-pain in terms of memory. I mean,
Yeah, interesting.
spare the rod and spoil the child. Well, I don't know who still even quotes that or remembers it, but there it is.
Our next question. So Stuart Miller, my colleague Stuart Miller, is here. Stuart, would you mind unmuting yourself, or I can unmute you, because I think it would be better, if you don't mind, for you to read your comment and have a chance to address Berel directly.
Okay, let me see if I can see it. I already added a correction to it, so I'm glad you're letting me read it. Okay, an observation supporting Berel. The irony of the Lachrymose reading of the Haggadah is that the creation of the work itself, that is the Haggadah, was the rabbi's hopeful response to how to carry on in the wake of the destruction of the temple. Without a temple, there was no Passover sacrifice, which was the central element of the festival celebration during temple times. There was no Haggadah then. They weren't sitting around at the temple in Jerusalem reading from a Haggadah. The Haggadah is a rabbinic text. The whole first half of the Haggadah, we have parallel sources from the Midrashic works. These come from much later, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. So there was no Haggadah then. After 70 CE, that is the destruction, the rabbis at Yavne turned what was essentially a temple rite into one centered on the home. This was actually a brilliant transformation led by none other than Rabban Gamliel. The retelling of the story, beginning with Israel's humble beginnings and emphasizing the redemption at the sea, replaced the sacrificial service, or the focus on the temple. A Lachrymose reading of the Haggadah certainly existed and persists, but it is a misreading of the very experience the rabbis brilliantly focused on in order not to relive Israel's troubled past, and here I correct myself, but in order to ensure the continued existence of the people of Israel.
Well, it's informative. What you've said is informative, but I don't think, claimed that pain is the only incentive for memory. I mean, there are celebratory memories as well. But I
Yes.
don't see that. What? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Pardon?
I'm agreeing with you, Berel.
Yeah. Well, it makes me uneasy.
Well, I don't know what makes it uneasy. What I'm saying is that the act of creating the Haggadah itself, even though it's being understood this way, and no doubt it is, although I didn't really think about it until you said it. But I agree, it's read like that by many, many Jews. But the creation of the Haggadah itself is a counterpoint to a Lachrymose interpretation of what the rabbis were up to. That's all I'm saying. I'm agreeing with you that both exist.
Yeah, all right. No, I think that's certainly the case. And the repetition of the Haggadah, the constancy of the text is very much part of the importance it has in Jewish collective memory and life. I mean.
Thank you, Stuart. So the next two questions, I'm going to group two questions together. One is from Gary Starr. And so Gary asks, what factors held the Jews together religiously and culturally if it was not the sense of other, or I think a sense of otherness and being singled out from their Christian neighbors? And there's a follow-up comment from Yehuda Pad, who says that there is an emphasis on distinctiveness, right? On not sharing meals with Gentiles, or the issue of distinguishing between what is kosher and non-kosher wine, so that there's an important sort of component of keeping Jews separate from Gentiles. And so I think to put these two questions together, to what extent do you see this Lachrymose view of Jewish history being part of trying to maintain a sense of Jewish otherness and distinctiveness? Is there something else that can be a point of uniting Jews, a point that pulls them together aside from this external force that pushes them together?
Well, I don't want to go so far as to say that suffering is good because it unites groups that suffer. I mean, which is a possible implication that might be drawn from what I have said. But the fact that if one asks about memory, individual memory and group memory as well, I mean, the most pointed and intense memories that one recalls, again, individually or as a group, involve a good deal of suffering. I mean, whatever the outcome, I mean, and obviously there's an emphasis on happy endings even there, but it's the challenge that's posed and that either is overcome or in some cases not overcome. I mean, the Jewish diaspora, the Jewish galut, is the galut over? I mean, at what point? The galut turns out, in my estimation, to be a cultural constant now of the Jewish people. It's a feature of that. And for some Jews, Israel is no less a galut than for those in Pensacola, Florida.
So I'll move on to the next question, and thank you for all these wonderful questions that are coming in. This is one that's submitted by Alan Berkowitz, and he didn't address it to everyone, so I'll just share it with everyone so you can all hear it. Alan writes, the absence of familiarity with the positive aspects of Jewish life by post-Jewish immigrant generations is certainly food for thought. And here I think it's interesting to think about the stories that the immigrants to America told about sort of leaving Eastern Europe and reasons for leaving Eastern Europe in particular. Alan notes the motivations and attitudes of those Jews who immigrated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries add to this narrative. Should the question be, what do we need to do to educate to overcome this misunderstood narrative? And I'm going to add on to that excellent question from Alan and just ask also in terms of Salo Baron, when he's writing this and beginning to conceive of this in the 1920s, to what extent is he reacting against this narrative that Eastern European Jews are telling in terms of why they left Eastern Europe to come to America, and why America is a better place for Jewish life, and sort of, to what extent is he reacting against that Lachrymose view that they've brought with them, that immigrant generation?
I'm not sure that I have the point of the question. I'm just not following it. What provokes the reaction?
Well, I think that the question is, to what extent are the sort of the immigrants who come at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century from Eastern Europe, the Jewish immigrants who come to America, to what extent are they responsible for sort of promulgating this Lachrymose view of Jewish history, as Salo Baron begins to write in the American context? And I think Alan's more pointed question is, how do we educate to overcome this misunderstood narrative? How would you propose that we sort of right this wrong, as you suggest?
Well, the second question is in a way easier, but more difficult to answer. I mean, how does one overcome, kind of self-congratulatory or self-explanatory attitude? I'm not sure about that, except to emphasize the importance of history and what actually occurred here, what the causes were. On the other point, I mean, could you go over that again, please? The first
Sure.
point.
So the first point was about to what extent do Eastern European Jews immigrating from Eastern Europe to America sort of bring this with them, this Lachrymose view of sort of justifying their reasons for leaving Eastern Europe and telling these stories about, this is why we had to flee and come to America, that we were escaping pogroms, as opposed to painting a picture of sort of long periods of Jewish flourishing in Poland, for example, that at many points in Jewish history was quite good to the Jews, but instead we get an image of Jews fleeing pogromists all the way to New York.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm sure there have been studies of the motivation for immigration, Jewish immigration to the United States. I'd be surprised if there aren't a variety of motives. And in distinguishing those who did come or wanted to come from those who did not. After all, I mean, we have to remember, I mean, the majority of Jews in the world, I mean, remained in Europe, not in the United States or in then Palestine. So, I mean, the motive, and again, I think it certainly is relevant here to consider the sources of Jewish immigration to the United States. Was it evenly, and here there are questions I don't know the answers to. Was it evenly spread over the Eastern European countries, all of them? Did it extend to the Sephardim and so on? I don't know the answer to that, but I would guess that there are certainly differences in the motivation that brought people here, or that encouraged them not to come or discourage the immigration.
And I think you've certainly given us sort of food for thought in terms of how we analyze the way in which history is written, and Jewish history is written. And to take this, I'd love to have students who could take this and begin to compare the way that this history is written in different places at different times. I have another question that's come in from Janice Franklin. And this is a question that I think follows up on some of the consequences of the sort of Lachrymose view of Jewish history, and the consequences of that view on Jewish politics in particular, in the way that Jews view themselves. So the question is, has the Lachrymose view in our own times prevented us, the Jewish people, from having more compassion for others? For example, specifically the Palestinians. And you can think about sort of how a victim narrative ends up putting you into sort of dynamic of competitive suffering? Or to follow up on the continuation of the question, is the Lachrymose view justified or used as an excuse for not overcoming difficulties in our relationship with others?
All of the above. All of the above. I mean, I think it's clear, yes, you know, that it has been used as an excuse or a pretext for a variety of modes of conduct, some of them, you know, acceptable and some disputable. I think there's no question about that. And one can see it in, it comes out in group reactions. One can see it in Israel's attitude towards the diaspora, you know, as it has evolved. If one can generalize about that, and there are general features, I think. So the idea of, you know, competitive suffering, well, I don't know how to address that.
I'm going to, I have one additional question, and if you're okay, maybe we'll make this the last question. And thank you for taking all of these questions. So this question comes from Eitan Marcus, who asks, in a comparative sense, how general is your thesis? And what he means is, so you've discussed the Lachrymose view of Jewish history, very specifically in Jewish history, but would you give the same message to the writing of African American history, or to a group of African Americans, or to Native Americans, who will tell you that their history of is a history of past and current oppression?
Well, I don't think the Jews have a patent on lachrymosity. You know, I mean, that's a, if one thinks in both in individual personal terms and of group terms, and in group terms, I mean, pain has a large role in memory, individual memory and collective memory. And one might even go so far as to say it has, part of its attraction is just the vividness with which it presents itself. And I think that's a phenomenon in one's own life. I mean, personally, individually, but it's also a phenomenon of group reaction and memory, painful events. Now, it's true, there are, you know, the kind of triumphalism that having survived, and having survived difficulties or challenges and suffering is a kind of victory. But one wouldn't want to say, and I don't say, that suffering is good, because if you overcome it, then you've overcome something real. Well, I mean, that argument has been made, you know, that Jewish identity has been shaped by the suffering it's encountered historically. Well, one can't deny, I mean, who would, that attacks on Jews and anti-Semitism in whatever form it takes has had an impact on Jewish history and on the Jewish present. But to base an identity as strong and multifaceted as Jewish identity on the fact that it's been you know, under pressure at various times, sometimes severe, sometimes not, it seems to me a distortion of that history. You know, that's a historical question, and it's not, I mean, I'm not the one to judge that in really specific terms, but I think that would be the general view.
Yeah. And I think there's definitely, I mean, part of this is also a political commentary, right? That there are certain ways, and you address this in your consequences, in which history can be used for political purposes. And there, I don't want to say that, I think you alluded to this in the talk, not necessarily benefits of anti-Semitism, but ways in which it can be used to support an incidence of anti-Semitism, support or reinforce certain political viewpoints within the Jewish community, right? So, you know, Theodor Herzl famously suggested that Zionism would solve the problem of anti-Semitism once and forever. And of course it didn't, but the there is sort of a relationship that continues between Zionism and anti-Semitism since the 19th century.
Yes.
So of course, when I say it's the last question, I get more comments and questions coming in. So I think Arnie Dashevsky is here, and I think he would love to just add a comment. Arnie, can I unmute you and you'll just say your comment out loud? Go ahead.
Yeah, I really appreciate a chance to be with Berel again. I think we were on the same floor in Manchester Hall when he was a visitor here on the second.
Yeah, sure.
Philosophy, and I was in sociology.
I'm glad to talk to you.
Listening to what you said, I see a really strong parallel to your point in 20th century sociological thought. For example, two former presidents of the American Sociological Association, both Jews. Louis Wirth, the first president, he'd been around for 30 or 40 years, but it wasn't until after the Holocaust, around 1948-49, that he was elected as the president. And another president, about 20 years later, Arnold Rose, both saw group identification as a function simply of external prejudice and discrimination, for example, anti-Semitism. In fact, Wirth wrote one of the few early sociological studies on Jews in 1928, it was published in 1928, The Ghetto. But this is where I think your point about just emphasizing the negative is not really a full understanding of Jewish life, Jewish civilization. Beginning in the 60s and 70s, sociologists studying the Jews focused on the formation of Jewish group identification by examining the internal communal and interpersonal relationships, in a way, an antidote to the Lachrymose view of Jewish identification. So I just wanted to offer the comments that I'm in sync with you, and I think many of my sociological colleagues are as well.
Well, I hope I didn't give the impression of suggesting that persecution is the key to understanding Jewish identity. I don't mean that at all. Of course not. Did it have an impact on Jewish identity? Of course. Why wouldn't it? How could it not? But the idea that Jewish identity, and this is a point that has been a thesis that has been defended, that somehow Jewish identity is a reaction. It seems putting the cart before the horse. I mean, it's not that it creates identity, but identity has to respond to circumstances of the world in which that identity grows. And this is what the Jews have done, and done very successfully. I mean, the idea, that Lachrymose view of Jewish history, the basic refutation of the Lachrymose view of Jewish history is Jewish survival. God, 3,000 years, and it's still, and never a very large percentage of any population. I mean, now what, 15 million in a world of 2 billion? Come on, I don't know if there is an explanation or there could be an explanation of that, but somehow the impulse for survival has been there, and it's been successful. I mean, beyond one's expectations. The idea of a group surviving and through the various periods of human history, or recent human history.
I'll read one last question that's come in, and I think this kind of reinforces your viewpoint, but I think it also, so Jerome Schwal writes, understanding that during the Middle Ages, Jews were known as moneylenders, financing states and rulers as well as private individuals. Jerome points out that to accumulate such wealth, that means that there must have been long periods of tranquility with conditions favorable to Jews. And so I think one of the questions is that a lot of anti-Semitic stereotypes also point to the idea that Jews had great success in the periods leading up to sort of outbreaks. So Jerome asks if you can comment on sort of that dynamic.
Well, I can only say that's undoubtedly true. that's an inference, and it seems a perfectly reasonable one, that they wouldn't have had the means for what they did unless there was a basis for those means. Yes, yes. So, I mean, does that disarm the ghetto wolves and so on? No, it doesn't. It doesn't undermine their existence, but it works in concert with that. It's as if social roles. How are social roles? How do social roles develop or evolve as such anyway? I mean, there are group differences. There's some differences that turn out to be more important at one time than other, color, race, doctrine, and so on, or practices. I mean, we verge here on asking for an explanation of Jewish survival. And if anybody in the audience has an answer to that, I'd be glad to hear it.
Okay, well, I think you've left us, and I don't know if anyone has an answer to the story of Jewish survival. I think Simon Schama made a multi-hour documentary that tried to address this issue. But I want to take a moment to thank you so much, Berel, for sharing your time and your wisdom with us. And I think this was really a wonderful program. And even though we couldn't do it in person on campus, in some ways this helped facilitate even greater participation. And on behalf of my colleagues at the University of Connecticut and those of us who were able to join for this program, I just want to thank you for joining us virtually. Why don't we either unmute or unmuted give Berel a virtual round of applause.
Well, I'll applaud also, and thank you for the opportunity. You know, here's a word, just personal. I grew up in Norwich, which was, I mean, it's not very far from Store. So UConn has been on my horizon from an early age. And I've also served, as you know, as a visitor there a couple of years. So mutual admiration society, I mean, if it's admiration. Anyway, thanks very much for the arrangements and for the listeners, the audience here. I'm grateful to you and for the questions, and we all have to keep pushing.
That's right. So I want to thank you again, and sei gesund, be well, everybody stay healthy, and we will continue to meet virtually and have opportunities for learning together, and we'll get through
Let
this.
me ask you, does UConn have Yiddish courses now?
So yeah, what we do, and Arnie is here, I see Arnie too. What we have now is a monthly Yiddish Tish.
Oy vey, oy vey, oy vey.
Ein Molling Monat? Nee.
That's my father jumping in.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
So hopefully we'll
tell them the story that we're reading. It's a great current story.
Yes, we are. We're reading a story by Yosef Opatashu called "A Chasana Afen Beis Olam." It's very appropriate for the times. It's a story about the tradition of getting two paupers in the shtetl married to ward off the Malach HaMavis in times of a pandemic. So we thought this would be a very appropriate story to read in the current time. So that's what
well, I can think of a variation of that, a Levaya under the chuppah. I mean.
Right.
Kol hakavod from somebody who went to NFA.
And everyone should support the Greenberg Center, Hillel, and the Federation. Because we're all part of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Henry.
Amen. Thanks very much, Avi.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and we'll see you all soon. Be well.
You too.